Hello, everyone. The story is, the neighbors forbade my family to enter our neighborhood through the gate because they are nobody in our neighborhood, but they did not know that my father is the sheriff of the local police. Even the HOA took our side. I remember the day we first arrived at our new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, an hour or so outside a larger city. My parents had saved up for years to move into a place that felt safe, comfortable, and close enough to my father's place of work. He served as a dedicated officer in the local police department, well respected in nearby communities, and had recently been promoted to sheriff. My mother often said that the promotion would mean his job came with additional responsibilities, but it also fulfilled a lifelong dream of his, to preserve peace, safety, and order in a place where families didn't have to lock their doors out of fear. Dad always believed in the decency of people when given the chance to do right, and he wanted to create an environment where everyone felt included and heard. When we pulled into our driveway for the very first time, my mother got out of the car and took in a deep breath, letting the reality of homeownership in this new area settle over her. Our new place was a single-story ranch house that had a white exterior with a small front porch, complete with 2 rocking chairs Dad found on sale at a hardware store. One of the house's best features was a large backyard surrounded by a sturdy wooden fence, perfect for summer barbecues and birthdays. I remember envisioning a life of tranquility here, imagining playing catch with my younger siblings while our dogs sprinted around in the grass, barking happily at the birds. We didn't know many people in the area at first, but one of the reasons we had chosen this neighborhood was because it had a reputable homeowners association, commonly known as the HOA, that took very good care of communal areas. The roads were well paved, the neighborhood park was regularly maintained, and people were known to follow the rules about appearances and upkeep. My mother had heard that sometimes HOAs could be strict or intimidating, but we felt that as long as we followed the guidelines, it would be a pleasant way to ensure property values stayed healthy and that the area itself remained inviting. On our first day moving in, we were greeted by a friendly couple from across the street, an older man named Harold and his wife, Teresa. They brought us a plate of homemade cookies and said they were excited to have a new family join the community. Their warmth and generosity seemed genuine, and my father, always the conversation starter, invited them into our living room, where boxes were still stacked in neat piles. While we were chatting, Harold and Teresa mentioned that if we needed help figuring out the best routes to take for commuting or which local diners served the best breakfast, they were more than happy to share their knowledge. We liked them right away. Over the next few days, we settled in. Dad had a few days off before the official start of his sheriff's duties, which gave him time to help with the heavy lifting and unboxing. Mom was able to organize the kitchen exactly how she wanted, labeling shelves and carefully positioning every plate and mug. My siblings and I were allowed to decorate our new rooms any way we liked, as a reward for putting up with the stress of moving. I spent hours putting up posters, placing my books on a new set of shelves, and plugging in a small lamp that gave my space a warm, cozy glow at night. For the first week or two, everything went smoothly. We met a few more neighbors, some polite but reserved, others warm and very open to conversation. My mother was invited to a small gathering at a house down the street, where they had a cookout, and she got to meet other parents in the area. One of them, a woman named Felicia, told my mother about the local civic groups and how they often held summer picnics to build connections among neighbors. That gave us further optimism about blending into the community. However, there was one family around the corner whose presence loomed even before we had any direct interaction with them. Almost everyone we met politely hinted that these people were particular or protective about the neighborhood. No one seemed to want to speak ill of them directly, but the underlying message was clear. Watch out for that household's sense of entitlement. They owned one of the largest homes in the neighborhood, a sprawling 2-story property with a gated driveway. I never caught their names right away, perhaps because the others were hesitant to speak them, but eventually I learned their first names were Stan and Valerie. They had 2 teenage sons who looked perpetually bored whenever I saw them in passing. At first I assumed that Stan and Valerie were simply a bit standoffish. Not everyone has the same outgoing personality, and I've met plenty of neighbors over the years who keep to themselves without any hostility. We saw Stan a couple of times while we were walking our dog. He never waved or said hello. He would often just stand in his driveway, arms crossed, eyes drifting somewhere around our direction, but never fully making eye contact. My dad, in typical fashion, tried waving once, but Stan just pivoted on his heel and walked back inside without a word. I didn't think too much of it until a few weeks later when something odd happened. Our neighborhood had a guarded gate at the main entrance and exit, an amenity paid for collectively through the HOA fees. Each resident had a digital pass that would open the gate when we drove up to it, or we could enter a personal code on a keypad if the sensor malfunctioned. One afternoon, my mother needed to leave for the grocery store in a hurry. Her pass had been giving her trouble all day, so she stopped at the keypad to enter her code. Suddenly, we saw Stan approach from the corner of our eye, gesturing with his hands and calling out loudly. He said in a raised voice, "You're not from here, are you? Let me see your pass." My mother, taken aback, explained that she was indeed a resident, that we'd moved in recently, and that our pass was simply malfunctioning. She offered to show him her code, but he just shook his head, repeating that she was nobody in our neighborhood, and that he had never seen us attend any of the regular social gatherings he deemed important. It was a bizarre comment. Social gatherings were optional, so it was strange to measure a neighbor's validity based on that alone. My mother insisted kindly that we lived in the small ranch house at the end of the road. Stan waved his hand dismissively, saying something about how we might be tenants or visitors, but we clearly didn't belong there in his eyes. I didn't understand at the time that this small incident was a foreshadowing of a larger conflict. Still, my mother let it slide, chalking it up to an overprotective neighbor who possibly had too much time on his hands. She came home with her groceries, irritated but not wanting to make a big deal out of it. When my father heard about it, he shrugged and said he'd try to talk to Stan man to man, maybe clear up any confusion. But life got busy, and Dad was settling into his new routine as sheriff, so there was no immediate resolution. Another strange thing happened a couple of days after that. The entire family was heading out for a Sunday morning trip. My younger sister had a softball game, and we were hoping to pick up breakfast from a local cafe before heading to the field. This time, as we approached the gate, Stan was there again, accompanied by Valerie. They both looked stern, and Valerie actually moved forward to block our car when she saw us. My father politely rolled down the window to ask if there was a problem. Valerie, in a voice that sounded more rehearsed than spontaneous, said something along the lines of, "We don't allow just anybody to come and go through our property's private gate." Dad tried to clarify that this wasn't their personal gate. This was the main entrance to the entire neighborhood, and each household had every right to pass. Valerie looked at him like he'd grown two heads, repeating that we didn't have any standing in the community, so we needed to take a different route. The only other route was a service road behind the homes, poorly lit, full of potholes, and it was typically restricted for emergency or maintenance vehicles. It was not the route meant for daily comings and goings. By now, my mother was visibly upset, and my siblings were confused. Why would they exclude us from the primary entrance? My father, not wanting to escalate the situation, kept calm and simply asked them to please move aside. This turned into a small argument. Stan refused to budge, as though he were the gatekeeper of the entire neighborhood. Finally, Dad got out of the car, walked over, and asked Stan to step away. In that moment, Stan repeated his words more aggressively. "You can't just take advantage of our gate privileges when you're nobody in our neighborhood." The word stung. I didn't fully grasp what he meant by nobody, but the insinuation was that we were beneath them socially, financially, or otherwise. Little did he know, my father was the newly appointed sheriff of the local police, a fact that Dad had never thought to advertise or brag about. Typically, Dad hoped to keep a low profile at home, separate from his law enforcement identity in the day-to-day sense. Seeing that Stan was unwavering, Dad calmly but firmly stated, "You might not realize who I am or what I do, but we have every right to be here. My name is Evan. I'm an officer of the local police, and I also serve as its sheriff. It's quite frankly my duty to ensure nobody's unlawfully blocking residents from their own homes." Stan and Valerie exchanged shocked glances, as if the words had instantly transformed Dad from nobody to someone they couldn't ignore. Valerie stammered some protest that this was a private matter, but Dad explained that preventing a lawful resident from accessing a public gate within a neighborhood community wasn't just neighborly nonsense, it was illegal. He told Stan they were going to have to move. After a tense pause, Stan slowly backed away. And Valerie followed suit, her face tight with fury. We drove out of the neighborhood, my mother and siblings rattled by the confrontation, but at least we could continue our day. That night, we held a family meeting in our living room. Dad explained that if Stan and Valerie continued to escalate the situation, we'd have to report it to the HOA, because the HOA had guidelines that guaranteed each resident equal use of shared amenities. My younger sister was worried about retaliation, but Dad said he'd handle it. He understood the fine line between being neighborly and letting yourself be taken advantage of. Mom wanted to find a diplomatic solution, perhaps talking to Stan and Valerie in a more relaxed environment. But given their behavior, it seemed improbable that they'd be open to casual conversation. A few more days passed without incident, no run-ins at the gate or anywhere else. It lulled us into believing maybe they had thought better of their actions. But that hope was shattered on a morning when Dad left for his shift early, around 6 o'clock. My siblings and I were still at home getting ready for school, and Mom was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Through the window, she noticed a black SUV idling outside our house. The occupant was none other than Stan, though he was alone. He just sat there for several minutes, occasionally looking directly at our front door. Mom tried to quell her uneasiness, focusing on flipping pancakes while telling us not to worry. Eventually, Stan drove away, but it was unsettling to think he was monitoring us. That evening, we received a letter in our mailbox that wasn't postmarked, meaning it was placed there by hand. It was from Stan and Valerie, though they hadn't written their names outright. The letter threatened that if we continued to misuse their gate, they'd take legal action. It ended with a line about how the neighborhood was established by founding families and that outsiders should mind their place. Mom read it twice, her voice trembling with each word. It was laughable in one sense, completely irrational, but also deeply offensive and intimidating. Dad, who usually tried to keep the peace, decided that enough was enough. He contacted the HOA the next day, explaining the situation and reading the letter over the phone. The HOA representative he spoke to was appalled, assuring Dad that every resident has equal rights to use the main entry gate. She recommended we file a formal complaint, which Dad did. The HOA guidelines made it clear that the gate was communal property, not owned by any particular resident, and that blocking another neighbor from using it was prohibited behavior with potential penalties. A few days later, we received a response from the HOA board saying they had scheduled a private meeting to resolve the matter. They invited Dad and Mom to meet with them as soon as possible, and they indicated they would also require Stan and Valerie to attend. The note ended with a line, "We hope to find an amicable resolution for the good of the neighborhood community. Our chairman Dustin will oversee this process." When Dad mentioned, "Even the HOA took our side, ask the chairman of the HOA." In passing, we felt relieved and vindicated. It was a huge relief to know that the official position of the neighborhood's governing body was aligned with reason and fairness. That evening, Dad told me that the chairman, Dustin, was someone he recognized from a community safety seminar he'd participated in a couple of years earlier, back when he was still a senior officer. Dustin was widely regarded as a fair, conscientious leader who wanted to keep the peace. The day of the meeting arrived, and my parents dressed in business casual attire, wanting to convey respect, but also readiness. We all felt a mix of nervousness and determination. Dad tried to soothe our concerns. "I'm not out to punish them. I just want them to respect our rights." My younger sister asked if the meeting was going to be confrontational, but Dad assured her that the HOA would set the tone for a calm discussion. Inside the HOA's small conference room, there was a rectangular table with chairs along each side. A row of potted plants lined the windows, and some framed pictures of the neighborhood park hung on the walls. Dustin greeted us with a firm handshake, thanking Dad for coming. Mom smiled politely, but looked anxious. Stan and Valerie were already seated across from the door, arms folded, faces taut. They offered no greeting other than a glare in our direction. Dustin started by stating the purpose of the meeting. "We've received a complaint from Officer Evans' family that they've been prevented from using our neighborhood gate, which is a communal amenity under HOA rules. Our objective today is to clarify everyone's rights and find a resolution so that these conflicts do not continue." Stan immediately jumped in, claiming that we had not established ourselves in the community and that their actions were for security reasons. Valerie chimed in, nodding vigorously. Dustin remained patient, letting them explain themselves without interruption. Stan went on to say that we didn't appear at some initial orientation session for new homeowners, a session we were never even informed about, and that we disrespected an unwritten tradition by using the main gate so freely. Valerie insisted that in certain exclusive neighborhoods, you had to earn the privilege to come and go without a special sticker or ID. Dad, still calm, explained that we had legally purchased our home, paid the HOA fees, and followed the rules. He politely pointed out that at no time had we broken any guidelines, and all we did was attempt to use the same access gate that every other neighbor used. He also mentioned the letter with threatening language, which he handed over to Dustin. The chairman's eyebrows rose as he read it, and it seemed to confirm the hostility that Stan and Valerie were projecting. Eventually, Dustin asked if Stan and Valerie had any proof that we were trespassing or misusing the gate. When they admitted they didn't, Dustin proceeded to review the official HOA policy, reading aloud clauses that specified that the main gate was indeed for all residents. He also cited language about how intimidation or harassment of neighbors was strictly disallowed. Dustin's tone was gentle but firm. Stan and Valerie were in violation of a core regulation of the neighborhood. Valerie tried to argue that with Dad being in law enforcement, he posed a conflict of interest, but Dustin shook his head. He reminded her that we pay into the HOA and have the same rights as everyone else. He repeated that if they had concerns about suspicious activity, the correct approach was to contact the HOA or local authorities, not to barge out and physically block neighbors from coming or going. Stan's face turned red with frustration, but he said nothing more when he realized he had little ground to stand on. By the end of the meeting, Dustin announced that the HOA was issuing Stan and Valerie a formal warning for harassment and attempted exclusion of rightful residents. They were also placed on a probationary period within the HOA, meaning any further misconduct could lead to fines or additional penalties, potentially even suspension of their own privileges. If they violated the HOA standards again in a significant way, it could escalate to legal consequences. Dustin underscored that the sheriff's family, the very people Stan and Valerie claimed were nobody in our neighborhood, were fully authorized to use all amenities, including the gate. With that settled, Dustin ended the meeting. Walking out of the room, we felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. None of us actually enjoyed seeing Stan and Valerie reprimanded, but we knew it was the only way to correct their behavior. We recognized that some people, for whatever reason, feel the need to assert dominance in a neighborhood, especially if they consider themselves founding families or if they have bigger homes. Dad said he hoped that after the warning, Stan and Valerie might reflect on their actions and see the harm in them. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Other neighbors started approaching us, thanking us for standing up. Apparently, Stan and Valerie had been a source of tension for years, though most neighbors tried to avoid direct confrontations. Harold and Teresa, the friendly couple across the street, came over with a homemade apple pie one evening and confided that they had once been chastised by Stan for parking a small RV along the curb briefly while cleaning out their driveway. Another neighbor, Felicia, the one who'd told us about local civic groups, mentioned that Stan once threatened to report her to the city for having an unauthorized yard sale, which was actually just a private rummage event for a charitable fundraiser. Many neighbors suspected that Stan enjoyed a sense of power from intimidating others. Now, with Dad's calm but firm stance, plus official HOA backing, it looked like Stan and Valerie finally had to curb their impulses. Dad's position as sheriff wasn't something he flaunted. He rarely mentioned it, and he told me, "In my line of work, respect is earned by how you treat people, not by your title." Still, it was clear that once Stan realized Dad could enforce the law, he thought twice about continuing his harassment. We noticed that whenever we drove through the gate now, Stan and Valerie avoided eye contact. Their teenage sons stopped throwing glares our way, though they never offered any greeting. I overheard Mom say to Dad one day, "This was bound to happen. Bullies back down once they know they can't walk all over you." An interesting side effect of the whole ordeal was that we got to know Dustin, the HOA chairman, much better. He dropped by our house a few times, not on official business, just to chat and make sure we were settling in well. Turns out, Dustin had a background in community counseling, which explained his calm demeanor during the meeting. He even invited Dad to speak at an upcoming neighborhood safety forum where different residents would learn about best practices for home security and watch programs. Dad agreed, eager to share tips that would help keep everyone safe and hopefully foster a friendlier atmosphere. After all, that was always Dad's main motivation for being in law enforcement, to create an environment where families felt safe in their own homes. As we integrated more deeply into the neighborhood, people started to see us as not just the new family, but as engaged community members. My mother joined a local gardening club that did monthly tours of each other's backyards, exchanging seeds and tips. She fell in love with the idea of planting tomatoes and peppers by the side of our fence, and one of the neighbors gave her a small herb starter kit. Before long, we had a thriving little garden that smelled of rosemary and basil, and we shared fresh vegetables with Harold and Teresa whenever we had a surplus. At school, my younger sister made new friends who lived in our same neighborhood. It was nice for her to be able to walk home with them sometimes, or ride bikes around the block on weekends. My father and mother felt much better knowing that with the HOA's stance clarified, there would be no more awkward disputes at the gate. In fact, Dad once saw Valerie while taking an early morning jog. She gave a half-hearted nod of acknowledgement, as if trying to be polite, but not knowing how to let go of her resentment. Dad simply nodded back. One day, as part of his sheriff duties, Dad did a traffic safety presentation at a local middle school. Some of my sister's friends recognized him and commented on how it was pretty cool that the new neighbor had such an important job. They said that it made them feel safer. Dad never wanted to overshadow the community dynamic by brandishing his authority, but it was nice to know that good relationships were forming based on mutual respect. Over time, I almost forgot about the initial confrontation. Life became busier with everyday routines, homework, sports, errands. We got to see more of the quieter parts of the neighborhood, the community's small lake, the nature trail that we never knew existed, until a neighbor recommended it. We even discovered a hidden gem, a small orchard run by a local farm family that sold fresh fruit and baked goods out of a modest stand. According to Mom, it was the best apple cider she'd ever tasted. Then came a knock on our door one sunny afternoon. 2 members of the HOA board, not including Dustin, who were gathering signatures to approve a new budget for improving the neighborhood's tennis courts. My mother invited them in for a quick chat, and before leaving, one of them confided that the board was still monitoring Stan and Valerie closely. If they caused any further issues regarding the gate or tried to impose unwritten rules on other residents, they would face steeper consequences. Dad thanked them for the update. They also mentioned that it was important for the whole community to unify and not allow intimidation tactics to become normal. It felt good to be on the right side of that message. A few months after the big blowout, Stan and Valerie's teenage sons were caught throwing a party while their parents were out of town. Several cars were parked haphazardly near the community gate, blocking access to the main entrance. The sheriff's department was called, and though Dad didn't handle the call personally, his deputies informed him about the situation. The vehicles were towed, and the teenage party was shut down. No major harm was done, but it underlined an important irony. The same people who claimed to be guardians of the neighborhood gate ended up being the ones causing trouble with blocked entry. This time, no one was singled out or threatened as an outsider. Instead, it was Stan and Valerie's own home that was creating the disturbance. The HOA fined them for the cars blocking the common area. Indeed, punishment was swift but fair. The same code that regulated the entire neighborhood was applied to them. That was a lesson in accountability. After that incident, we saw less of Stan and Valerie. They started keeping a lower profile, possibly embarrassed by the irony of being found in violation themselves. The rest of the neighborhood carried on, planning picnics, block parties, and holiday festivities. My parents made sure to attend these events whenever possible, wanting to show they were part of the community. My father, in particular, was asked to say a few words at a holiday gathering about community safety and respect. He kept it short and sweet. We share these streets, these sidewalks, and these public areas. This is your home. Let's respect one another and stand together, not against each other. His speech was met with applause, even from Stan, who was there with his arms folded, but softened his expression just enough to clap politely. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I might not have believed it. That applause suggested that maybe, just maybe, He recognized that working together was more beneficial than standing apart, or perhaps he was simply trying to maintain appearances. Either way, the tension gradually tapered off after that day. My siblings and I reflected on how everything had started, how we were once labeled nobody in our neighborhood, barred from using the gate. There were nights when we worried about running into Stan or Valerie at the gate or while walking our dog. We felt a sense of anxiety in our new home, which was supposed to be a place of comfort and security. But those fears gradually evaporated as the truth came to light. Dad was the sheriff of the local police, a position he carried with dignity and a belief in justice. Even though he could have wielded that authority more forcefully at times, he chose to rely on dialogue and community-based resolutions when possible. The HOA, to its credit, recognized the violation and stood with us. Even the HOA took our side. Ask the chairman of the HOA, Dad would occasionally say in jest when friends asked about our move. It was nice to know that Dustin and the others on the board were dedicated to fairness rather than bowing to the biggest house on the block. Looking back, my mother always emphasizes how the situation taught us about the importance of standing up for our rights without stooping to hostility. She notes that if we had retaliated with anger or tried to out-intimidate Stan and Valerie, we might never have resolved the issue, or we could have turned the entire neighborhood against us. Instead, by following the proper channels, complaining to the HOA, attending the scheduled meeting, and abiding by their rules, justice was served in a calm, bureaucratic manner. Though sometimes slow, it was thorough and ultimately effective. I learned an important personal lesson. Appearances can be deceptive, and assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't can create dangerous conflicts. Stan and Valerie saw us as outsiders, but ironically, it was Dad's role as sheriff that eventually made them see that we could not be ignored or belittled. I also realized that people in positions of power, like Stan and Valerie with their big house and long-standing presence in the neighborhood, don't always have the moral high ground, and those who do hold official power, like Dad, often choose not to brandish it unless it's absolutely necessary. That dynamic taught me a lot about humility and the difference between earned respect versus forced submission. Things didn't end with some grand apology from Stan and Valerie, but they did eventually leave us alone. They continued to attend neighborhood events sporadically, but they kept a polite distance. My mother continued her gardening club activities. My father continued his duties as sheriff, and my siblings and I became more ingrained in our local schools and community clubs. We made good friends, from the soccer fields to drama classes and everywhere in between. One day, I actually bumped into Stan at a local hardware store. I was picking out paint for a school project while Dad grabbed some supplies for one of his small carpentry hobbies. Stan was alone, comparing different types of lawn fertilizer. I felt a little pulse of anxiety, not sure if he was going to say something unpleasant. To my mild surprise, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement, muttered hello, and then went on about his business. It wasn't friendly, but it also wasn't hostile. In a weird way, it felt like progress. I guess that's what real life is like. Not everything ties up in a perfect bow with heartfelt apologies and newly minted friendships. Sometimes people remain in polite neutrality, and that's enough of a solution. No matter what, the punishment that came to the negative people in this story, Stan and Valerie, was the official warning from the HOA, plus the fines and additional oversight for their subsequent mishaps. In a way, that was justice served, and it was what made them finally cease their attempts to block us from living a normal life. In the months and years to come, we embraced the neighborhood more fully. I joined a youth mentorship program that Dad recommended. My sister tried out for the school's softball team and made the starting lineup. My mother befriended Felicia, who invited her to co-plan some charitable events in the community center. Harold and Teresa remained delightful neighbors, dropping by with baked goods or having us over for casual dinners. They reminisced about how the conflict with Stan and Valerie had been a catalyst for some positive changes in the HOA's enforcement policies. Thanks to that incident, the board clarified the process for reporting neighborly disputes and reaffirmed that no single household had dominion over shared property. One highlight that stands out was when the neighborhood formed a safety committee chaired by Dad and Dustin, focusing on everything from better lighting near the gate to a system for communicating any suspicious activity. Despite the awkwardness with Stan and Valerie, the rest of the neighborhood found unity, largely because of that event. Sometimes adversity brings people closer together, Dad said once at a committee meeting. He didn't mention Stan and Valerie by name, but everyone knew the gist of what he meant. I think the most enduring impact of that entire ordeal was the realization that we could thrive here. My family and I were not nobody in our neighborhood. We were members of the community, as real and legitimate as anyone else. We had neighbors who stood with us, an HOA that listened, and a father whose passion for justice guided us through the conflict. If Stan and Valerie's attempted gatekeeping had succeeded, we would have lived in fear or become reclusive. Instead, we faced the problem with honesty and official channels, ensuring that those who tried to rule the neighborhood were reminded they, too, had to follow the same rules as everyone else. Ultimately, the negative people in this story, those who tried to label us as nobodies, received their due consequences. The HOA levied a warning, put them on probation, and later fined them when their activities blocked the gate and disrupted the community. They learned that brandishing intimidation and arrogance would not prevail here. Meanwhile, our family continued to cultivate friendships, attend local events, volunteer, and embrace the sense of unity that Stan and Valerie once tried to deny us. In a realistic, everyday sense, that's the best outcome we could have hoped for. The antagonists faced accountability, and we got the fair treatment we deserved. Thank you for watching.